Let me thank all of you for being here. Let me thank those who couldn't get into the room or outside. Let me thank Neil Levesque and the St. Anselm's Institute of Politics for hosting this event. Neil has done this for so many years, and he does a great job, and I appreciate all that he does. It has always been my view that good policy is good politics. If you deliver for the American people, if you address their needs, they will respond accordingly. It has also been my view that being honest with the American people, even when speaking the truth, is uncomfortable and painful, is not only the right and responsible thing to do, but it is also good politics. And that's what I hope to do this afternoon. The American people, the American people are tired of press releases. They're tired of photo ops. They're tired of tweets. And they're tired of snappy one-liners. They want an honest analysis of what is going on in our society now, and they want leadership which provides answers to the many crises that we face. They want to understand why we are where we are today and how we can move to a better place. Make no mistake about it. Today, all across our country, there are deep feelings of anger, unease, discontent, and foreboding. That is true for those who define themselves as progressive, as I do, or those who see themselves as conservative or moderate. It is true for Democrats, Republicans, and independents. It's true whether you live here in New England, California, the Midwest, the South, or the Rocky Mountains. In a world which is changing rapidly in so many respects, many of our people are anxious. They feel left behind, and they are uncertain about what the future will be for them and their kids. Perhaps most importantly, they feel powerless to alter the course of events and believe their elected officials are not only failing them, but have little understanding of the pain that they are experiencing. Many are even questioning whether our current form of government is capable of addressing their needs or responding effectively to the crises we face. It is no secret that I want Joe Biden to be re-elected president. And that he and I share the goal of beating back right-wing extremism. We also want Democrats to have majority control over the Senate and the House and governor's mansions and state houses all across this country. That is what we want. In my view, however, if that is going to happen, if we are going to defeat creeping authoritarianism and right-wing extremism, there has got to be an ideological change of course. Democrats up and down the line are going to have to be much clearer to the American people as to what they stand for and, most importantly, which side they are on in the great struggles that we face. As a U.S. Senator, I am more than aware that most Democrats are prepared to take on a reactionary Republican Party which wants more tax breaks for billionaires, wants cuts to Social Security, cuts to Medicare, cuts to Medicaid, cuts to education and nutrition programs, and is a party which largely ignores the existential threat of climate change. Almost every Democrat I know stands with the women of this country in their fundamental right to control their own bodies and Democrats are united in their opposition to racism and discrimination against the LGBT community. But if Democrats are serious about winning elections and addressing the major crises that we face, they must go further. They must embrace the working class of this country in a way which hasn't been done in almost 60 years. Frankly, it is absolutely absurd that given the anti-worker ideology and policies of the Republican Party, that party now has more working class support than Democrats. It should be deeply worrying that, according to recent polls, Democrats are losing more and more support within the Latino community and even among African American men. That has got to change, not just for the well-being of the Democratic Party, but for the future of our country. The Democrats, once and for all, must reject the corporate wing of the party and empower those who are prepared to create a grassroots, multiracial, multi-generational, working class party in every state of this country. Democrats, through words and action, must make it clear that they stand with a struggling working class, a disappearing middle class, and millions of low-income Americans who today are barely surviving. They must make it clear that they are prepared to boldly take on the powerful corporate interests who have so much power and influence in Washington and its state capitals throughout the country. They must make it clear that they will protect the needs of young people who, everything being equal, might well end up with a lower standard of living than their parents. And they must make it clear that they will vigorously fight for the seniors of our country and the disabled, who so often face difficult and expensive health care decisions. Perhaps most importantly, Democrats must reject austerity economics and understand that with the new and innovative technologies being developed, we now have the capability, as never before in world history, to provide a decent standard of living for every man, woman, and child in this country. In fact, we now have the opportunity of creating an incredibly bright future. Democrats must make clear that these new technologies and the artificial intelligence now being created must work to benefit all of our people and not just the corporations that own that technology. In my view, if Democrats are prepared to do that, they will win this election and win it comfortably. If not, frankly, I am not sure what the election outcome will be, or for that matter, what the future of our country holds. Now, if we're going to be honest with the American people, we have got to acknowledge the realities of today with the understanding that many of these crises have existed for decades. And within that context, let me say a few words about some of the achievements of the Biden administration in its first 3 years. And I know something about it because I have been there working with the president. President Biden and those of us who have worked with him have every right to be proud of what we have accomplished, especially given the fact that that work was done in a very divided and contentious Congress. Frankly, we didn't get a lot of help from Republicans. Yes, we should take pride in the American Rescue Plan, which is one of the lowest moments in modern American history. Remember back a few years ago? When we were dealing with the worst public health crisis in 100 years and the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. We all remember the fears and the pain that existed. Well, as a result of that legislation, we helped revive our economy far faster than anyone could have imagined. We should be proud of that. We should be proud in finally making significant investments in rebuilding our crumbling infrastructure. You remember years and years, everybody talked. Well, guess what? We did it. We're starting to rebuild our roads, our bridges, our wastewater plants, broadband, and creating hundreds of thousands of good-paying jobs in the process. Yes, we should take pride in the unprecedented investments we have made in renewable energy and energy efficiency. And yes, while we have a very long way to go, we should take pride in that we have finally begun to take on the greed of the pharmaceutical industry. And yes, after disastrous trade agreements that impacted our manufacturing base, we should take pride in the fact that we are now in the process of rebuilding manufacturing in the United States, creating a lot of good jobs as we do that. Yes, we should take pride in the fact that unemployment today is extremely low. Here in New Hampshire, it is all of 1.7%. We should take pride also that inflation, which not so long ago stood at 9%, has been reduced to almost 3%. Yes, we should take pride in the fact that President Biden, more than any president in history, has created an administration that actually looks like America in its diversity. That is no small thing. Yes, we should take pride in what we've accomplished. But at the same time, this 2024 campaign, at the presidential level and on down, must be honest with the American people and acknowledge the very real challenges that persist for working families, low-income Americans, and the middle class. While we take pride in our accomplishments, we must also recognize the reality that tens of millions of our fellow Americans continue to live in pain and despair. And interestingly, this is exactly what President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you all remember Franklin Roosevelt? It's exactly what President Roosevelt, whose portrait now hangs in President Biden's Oval Office, it's what Roosevelt managed to do when he ran for a second term in 1936. FDR, perhaps the most popular and effective president in American history, remember that's the guy who won 4 terms, governed during the extremely difficult periods of the Great Depression and World War II. On January 20th, 1937, Roosevelt gave an extraordinary speech at his second inaugural, in which he took the opportunity not only to focus on his accomplishments, but rather on the unfinished business that he was determined to complete. And this is what he said. I want you all to appreciate this. Now, this is a guy who has completed his first term. He's now in his second term. This is what he said. He said, in this nation, I see tens of millions of its citizens, a substantial part of its whole population, who at this very minute are denied the greater part of what the very lowest standards of today call the necessities of life. Now, he was president for 4 years, and this is what he's talking about. He says, I see millions of families trying to live on income so meager that the pall of family disaster hangs over them day by day. Sound familiar? I see millions whose daily lives in city and on farm continue under conditions labeled indecent by a so-called polite society half a century ago. And he continued, and this is kind of famous lines. He said, I see millions denied education, recreation, and the opportunity to better their lot and the lot of their children. I see millions lacking the means to buy the products of farm and factory, and by their poverty denying work and productiveness to many other millions. And this line you'll all remember. Remember, he was president for 4 years. This is what he said. I see 1/3 of the nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished. And he concluded by saying, it is not in despair that I paint you that picture. I paint it for you in hope, because the nation, seeing and understanding the injustice in it, proposes to paint it out. We are determined to make every American citizen the subject of his country's interest and concern. And we will never regard any faithful, law-abiding group within our borders as superfluous. The test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little. End of quote. Speech by Roosevelt is extraordinary for its candor and honesty in describing the gravity of the problems confronting America in his time. And even though he was the sitting president, he was prepared to talk about those problems. In other words, despite the progress he had made in his first term, he understood that much more had to be done. Of course, he was not really, and this is an important point, he was not really informing people about conditions in America. Instead, he was reflecting back what people already knew, what they felt in their hearts and what they experienced in their day-to-day lives. He was reflecting their reality. In that way, his remarks were not an indictment of his own administration, but instead a rallying cry for working class families across the country to come together with him in a joint effort to cure those ills. In my view, we need to do now what Roosevelt did then. We need to be clear to working people that we understand the reality of their lives, and our political discourse must reflect that reality. And what is that reality, if we're going to be honest? And here it is. In the wealthiest country in the history of the world, which is what we are now, tens of millions of our people struggle to put food on the table, find affordable housing, affordable health care, affordable prescription drugs, affordable child care, and affordable educational opportunities. That is an indisputable reality, and it is imperative that we acknowledge that reality, that we do not run away from it. At a time of unprecedented income and wealth inequality, while the billionaire class and the 1% are doing better than at any time in the history of the United States, over 60% of our people live paycheck to paycheck, and many are working for starvation wages and under terrible working conditions. There are people in America who work, they don't have any vacation time, their scheduling is awful, sometimes they're despite massive increases in worker productivity and an explosion in technology. The average American worker is making $45 a week less today than he or she did 50 years ago. You know why people are angry? That's why people are angry. And that is adjusting, of course, for inflation. And when I was a kid growing up a few years ago, working class families, and I come from a working class family, one person in those days was able to earn enough money to pay the bills. Very few families that you know do not now have two breadwinners, often working really crazy hours. Today, in America, we have the highest rate of childhood poverty of almost any major country on earth. Unbelievably, fewer than half of working-age Americans have any retirement savings. People 50, 60 years old, they've been working their whole lives, they got nothing in the bank as they face retirement. And that number, of course, is even higher for women. Today, despite spending twice as much per capita on health care as almost any other country, 85 million Americans are uninsured or underinsured, and 1 out of 4 patients cannot afford the prescription drugs their doctors prescribe. As a result of a massive shortage of doctors, nurses, mental health providers, and dentists, many millions of Americans wait months in order to get a medical appointment. And tens of thousands die every year because they cannot afford the health care they need when they need it. Tens of thousands die unnecessarily. While 3 people, 1, 2, 3, own more wealth than the bottom half of American society, nearly 600,000 Americans are homeless, and some 18 million households spend over half of their income to put a roof over their heads. While major Wall Street firms gobble up working class neighborhoods in order to gentrify them and make huge profits, workers are unable to find the housing that they can afford. There was once a time, not so many years ago, when the United States led the world in terms of the quality of our educational systems. We had the highest percentage of people who were college graduates and a very high quality public school system. Today, in an extremely competitive global economy,
That is no longer the case, and we now lag behind many other countries in our educational achievements. In many states, teachers are paid embarrassingly low salaries. Meanwhile, over 45 million Americans are drowning in over $2 trillion in student debt for the crime of getting a higher education. Today in America, not only do we have more income and wealth inequality than we have ever had, we have more concentration of ownership than ever before in sector after sector of our economy, whether it is finance, agriculture, energy, defense contracting, media, transportation, healthcare, or big tech. A small number of large multinational corporations control what is produced, distributed, and sold. The idea that our economy today, the rhetoric that we hear, is based on small business and rugged free enterprise and competition is nothing more than a myth. But the crises we face today are not just economic, and I think everybody knows that. In communities throughout the country, there is an increase in crime. We are struggling with a major opioid epidemic, and I know New Hampshire and Vermont have been hit hard by that. And we are now experiencing the worst mental health crisis in modern history, exacerbated by the COVID pandemic. Our life expectancy, how long we live, which is already lower than most other major countries, is getting even lower in many parts of the country because of widespread addictions to alcohol and drugs, increased obesity, and a growing suicide rate. Racism, sexism, and homophobia continue to plague the country as we see an increase in hate crimes. With the school year now beginning, parents and kids worry about the epidemic of gun violence, and they are asking themselves, could it happen in our school? Further, the American people know that our political and constitutional systems are in trouble. We have a former president who refused to acknowledge his defeat and encouraged a violent insurrection to overturn the election results. We have state legislatures all across this country working overtime to make it harder for people of color and young people to vote, and who are gerrymandering districts in order to stay in power. And last but not least, we have a campaign finance system which is totally corrupt. And which enable billionaires through their super PACs to buy elections. The American people also know that we have a Supreme Court that has, for the last 24 years, made far-reaching decisions that have undermined faith not only in the judiciary, but the ability of our government to respond to the needs of the people. And that is not only their absurd and anti-democratic decision in Citizens United, but their willingness to undermine decades of precedent and deny the women of this country the constitutional right to control their own bodies. The result of all of this is that faith in our democratic system is now extremely low. Many millions of Americans have not only lost faith in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, but they have lost faith in democracy itself. And then, on top of all of that, if that's not enough, and just when you think the challenges we face could not be greater, the United States and the rest of the world face the existential threat of climate change. What a summer it has been. We have breathed the unhealthy smoke coming from the terrible forest fires in Quebec. We have seen the floods in my state, in Vermont, the worst natural disaster in my state since 1927. We have observed the horrific death toll in Hawaii from the horrible flash fires. We have observed the drought, floods, fires, and record-breaking heat waves in Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America. Increasingly, our people understand that climate change is not only real, but that the planet is well on its way to becoming less healthy and habitable for our kids and future generations. Given their fears, millions of young couples throughout the world are literally wondering whether it even makes sense for them to have kids. So where do we go from here? Now, it's easy to define the problems. It's a lot harder to solve them. How do we revitalize American democracy? And how do we move forward toward a government which, to quote President Lincoln, is of the people, by the people, and for the people? In a divided nation, how, in fact, do we bring our people together to address the economic, social, and environmental crises we face and create a government that works for all and not just the few? In my view, by articulating the reality of Americans' lives, we will begin to recreate the trust that has evaporated in the institutions of government and the major political parties. To be credible, we have to name names and demand accountability. It just cannot be that every political leader and every corporation and every institution other than Donald Trump and a few Republicans is acting in good faith. The truth is that we are where we are today because the people on top, the people with the power, are extraordinarily greedy, dishonest, arrogant, irresponsible, and could care less about the needs of ordinary Americans. Let us confront reality. It's not, as Republicans tell us, the fault of immigrants or racial minorities or women or LGBT people or Muslims or any other minority group for the very desperate situation that too many people find themselves in. That's what Republicans do. And that's what demagogues always do. They pick a group and they blame them for everything. The reason so many have it so bad is that never before in the history of the United States have so few had it so good, owned so much, and had so much economic power. Never before in the history of the United States have so few, through their super PACs, campaign contributions, lobbyists, and ownership of the media had so much political power. And never before in our history has it been more necessary for all of us standing together to wrest that incredible power away from the few and redistribute it to the many. Whether it is Wall Street, we have 3 investment firms, 3, exercise incredible economic power as they control over $20 trillion in investments. Got it? 3 firms control $20 trillion in investments and combined are the major stockholders in the vast majority of S&P companies. Whether it is the health insurance companies who make huge profits off a dysfunctional healthcare system that cost us twice as much per capita as virtually any other country on earth. Whether it is the pharmaceutical industry, which makes tens of billions in profit every year, while charging us by far the highest prices in the world for prescription drugs. Whether it is the major defense contractors who produce massive cost overruns and have jacked up our military spending to some $900 billion a year. Whether it is the food industry, which has dramatically increased prices at the grocery store while reaping enormous profits. Whether it is big tech, which intentionally addicts our kids to social media platforms and contributes to the mental health crisis facing so many young people. Perhaps most important, it is the fossil fuel industry, which has lied and lied and lied for decades about the causation of climate change, and to add insult to injury, is now enjoying record-breaking profits as they raise the price of gas at the pump. Add it all together, and what we are seeing is an unprecedented level of corporate greed. In fact, over half of the inflationary costs that we have seen in the United States in recent years have nothing to do with the war in Ukraine, nothing to do with broken supply chains, but everything to do with the greed of corporate America, the prices they have raised, and the record-breaking profits they are making. By the way, this is not just an American issue. This is a global issue. While over 6 million people throughout the world died in the terrible COVID pandemic, and millions more became ill because they were forced to go to work to support their families, the billionaire class used the pandemic to make themselves even richer. During the first 2 years of the pandemic, listen to this, remember, people are dying all over the world. Workers going to work, getting sick, dying. During the first 2 years of the pandemic, the world's 10 richest men more than doubled their fortunes from a mere $700 billion to $1.5 trillion. Meanwhile, 99% of humanity saw their incomes go down, and an additional 160 million people throughout the world were forced into poverty. These multi-billionaires want it all, and they are prepared to step on anybody who gets in their way. They are not nice guys. Now, no matter how much they contribute to the local art museum or their local charity, they are not nice people. This is the kind of corporate greed we're looking at now. And the kind of greed that virtually all Americans, whether they are black or white or Latino, Asian American or Native American, this is the kind of greed that the American people are increasingly disgusted with. And this is where good policy is good politics. If we are looking at bringing the American people together, we have got to have the courage to take on corporate greed. And in that regard, we should take another lesson from President Roosevelt as he was fighting against the cabal of the economic elite of his era. In a 1936 campaign speech in Madison Square Garden during the Democratic Convention, this is what Roosevelt said, quote, he's talking about his first 4 years in office. We had to struggle with the old enemies of peace, business, and financial monopoly, speculation, reckless banking, class antagonism, sectionalism, war profiteering. They had begun, the elite had begun, to consider the government of the United States as a mere appendage to their own affairs. Boy, does that sound familiar to me. See the lobbyists in Washington. We now know, he continued, that government by organized money is just as dangerous as government by organized mob. And he continued. And I think this is the main point. Quote, never before in all of our history have these forces been so united against one candidate as they stand today. They are unanimous in their hate for me, and I welcome their hatred. And he continued, because there's so many lessons to be learned. He continued, quote, I should like to have it said of my first administration that in it the forces of selfishness and of lust for power met their match. I should like to have it said of my second administration that in it these forces met their master, end quote. That is what Roosevelt said in the 1936 campaign, which, by the way, he won in a landslide. And that is what we should be saying in the 2024 campaign. Like FDR, we should not be afraid to welcome the hatred of the billionaire class that is doing so much harm to our country. Whether they like it or not, we must address the crisis of wealth and income inequality and demand that billionaires and large profitable corporations start paying their fair share of taxes. Whether they like it or not, we must increase the federal minimum wage from a starvation wage of $7.25 an hour to a living wage of at least $17 an hour. Whether they like it or not, we need to end the concentration of ownership in this country and break up giant monopolies that are strangling small businesses and keeping inflation artificially high. Whether they like it or not, we need to make certain that every worker in this country who wants to join a union has the opportunity to do so. We can no longer tolerate the illegal anti-union activities of Starbucks, Amazon, and other major corporations. Whether they like it or not, we need to establish once and for all that health care is a human right, not a privilege. We must take on the greed of the insurance companies that made over $69 billion in profits last year, while tens of millions of Americans died because they're unable to get the medical care they need. The current health care system is broken. It is dysfunctional. We need to fight for Medicare for all. Whether they like it or not, we need to take on the greed of the drug companies, who have over 1,800 paid lobbyists in Washington. You got that? 1,800. So that we no longer continue to pay by far the highest prices in the world for medicine. Whether they like it or not, we must take on the military-industrial complex, cut military spending, and use those savings to invest in expanding Social Security benefits, affordable housing, child care, and education. Whether they like it or not, we will save the planet by transforming our energy system away from fossil fuels to renewable energies and energy efficiency. Whether they like it or not, we will overturn Citizens United and move to public funding of elections. Billionaires cannot be allowed to continue to buy elections. Now let me conclude by saying this. In the United States, and in fact throughout the whole world, what we're dealing with here is actually going on in many for the establishment, faith in the establishment and their institutions is in decline. People want change. They're not happy with the status quo. And change will come. The question is, what kind of change will it be? Will it be the kind of change that is dominated by the wealthy and powerful? A change which bans books, denies our history, pits one group of Americans against another, and treats women as second-class citizens, not smart enough to make important decisions for themselves. That is one kind of change that could very well happen. But there is another kind of change which could happen. And that is a change that would create a fairer, more just, and more democratic society based on love, solidarity, and compassion. Change motivated by the principles of economic, social, and racial justice. The choice is clear, and I know the kind of change I will be fighting for. Thank you all very much.